Moving into an old house always comes with stories. Some are harmless. The previous owners, the history of the neighborhood, maybe even a legend or two. But sometimes, the stories are true. And sometimes, the past refuses to stay buried. My family moved into the house in the fall of 1998. It was a beautiful old Victorian-style home, built in the early 1900s, with high ceilings, a wraparound porch, and more rooms than we knew what to do with. My parents were thrilled. I was terrified, because from the moment we arrived, something felt wrong. Like the house was watching us. Like it didn't want us there. The first thing we noticed was the smell. It wasn't strong, but it was always there. A faint, smoky scent that clung to the walls and settled in the air. At first, we thought it was just the age of the house. But no matter how many times my mother scrubbed the floors or how many windows we left open, the smell never went away. Then came the noises. Soft at first, like the house settling. Then footsteps. At night, when everything was still, we would hear it. The slow, deliberate sound of someone walking upstairs. Step, 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 back and forth, just above our heads. Like they were pacing, waiting. I told my parents, but they brushed it off. Old houses make noises, my dad said. I tried to believe him, until I saw her. It happened late one night. I had woken up thirsty, so I crept downstairs to get some water. The kitchen was dark except for the glow of the street lamp outside, casting long shadows across the floor. And that's when I saw it. A figure standing at the far end of the hallway. She was tall and thin, wearing an old-fashioned dress, her hair pulled back in a tight bun. She wasn't looking at me. She was staring at the front door, perfectly still, like she was waiting for someone to come home. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Then, she turned her head, just slightly, not enough to see her face, not enough to be human, and before I could scream, she vanished. I ran back to my room, pulling the blankets over my head, heart hammering in my chest. I told myself it was a dream, that I was just tired. But the next morning, my little brother said something that made my blood run cold. "I saw a lady last night," he said over breakfast. I froze. "Where?" my mother asked. He pointed toward the front door. She was standing right there. After that, things got worse. The footsteps became louder. Doors slammed shut on their own. And the smell of smoke grew stronger, thick and choking, like something was burning. One night, my mother woke up screaming. She said she had dreamed of fire, of a woman pounding on the walls, trying to escape. When she woke up, her room was filled with the overpowering scent of smoke. But there was no fire. Then came the scratches. Deep, jagged marks appeared on the wooden floors overnight, like something had clawed its way through the house. The walls, too, bore long, uneven scratches. My father accused us of doing it, but we all knew the truth. Something else was living there with us. Something trapped. Something angry. We started looking into the history of the house. And that's when we learned the truth. Before our house was built, there had been a hotel on the same land. And in 1912, it had burned to the ground, trapping several guests inside, including a woman in a long dress. A woman who had been seen standing at the front entrance, waiting for someone to come save her, waiting for someone to let her out. The realization sent chills down my spine. The woman we had seen, she had never left. She was still waiting, still trapped. And every night, when we heard those footsteps above us, she was pacing the halls, trying to find her way out. Things escalated after that. The television turned on by itself, always showing static. We heard whispers at night, faint voices calling out from empty rooms. My little brother started talking to someone in his sleep, mumbling things like, "I can't open the door," and "It's too hot." And then, one night, we woke up to the sound of screaming, a deep, wailing cry that filled the entire house. When we ran to check, there was no one there, just the suffocating scent of smoke. One evening, I stayed up late, hoping to see her again. Maybe if I saw her, I could ask what she wanted. I sat in the dark, watching the hallway. At 3 a.m., the air turned freezing cold. I saw the doorknob turn, slowly, deliberately. The door creaked open, and standing there was the woman. Her dress was burned, her hair singed, her eyes hollow. She raised a blackened hand, pointing at the front door, and whispered, "Let me out." We moved out a year later. My parents never admitted the house was haunted, but we all knew, because even after we left, the smell of smoke never faded. And sometimes, when I pass by that old house, I swear I see a figure standing in the window, waiting, hoping, still trying to escape. There was always something off about our basement. Even as a child, I hated going down there. It wasn't just the usual fear of the dark. It was something deeper, a feeling that something was down there with me, watching, waiting. I told myself I was imagining it, but years later, I learned the truth. Something had been living in our basement all along, and it didn't want us there. Our house was old, built sometime in the early 1900s. It had been in my family for generations. My great-grandfather built it, and since then, it had passed down from one relative to the next. Most of the house was beautiful. Wide wooden staircases, big windows, and a wraparound porch. But the basement? The basement was wrong. It was unfinished. Just a cold, damp space with exposed brick walls and wooden support beams. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of mold and something else, something rotten. And no matter how many times we cleaned it, the smell always came back. The first time I felt something truly unnatural was when I was 7. My mother sent me downstairs to grab a can of soup. I hesitated at the top of the stairs, staring down into the darkness. Even with the light on, the basement always felt dim, like the shadows were too thick. I forced myself to move. One step, then another. The floor was ice cold beneath my bare feet. I reached the shelf where we kept the canned food, grabbing the first thing I saw. Then, the light flickered, and I heard it, a breath, right behind me. I froze. The hairs on my arms stood up, my entire body locked in fear. I wasn't alone. Slowly, I turned my head. For a split second, I thought I saw something, a tall, dark shape standing just beyond the reach of the light. Then the bulb flickered again, and it was gone. I ran up the stairs, nearly dropping the can in my hands. My mother laughed when I told her I was scared. She didn't know. She didn't feel what I felt. As I got older, the feeling never went away. It got worse. Noises in the night, whispers, soft shuffling sounds, like bare feet moving across the cold floor. Sometimes, we would hear knocking. 3 slow, deliberate knocks, always coming from inside the basement. One night, my mother woke up to find the basement door wide open. We always kept it locked. Always. But there it was, creaking slightly in the darkness, the smell of mildew seeping up from below. She thought maybe she had left it open by mistake. Until it happened again, and again, and again. Then came the dreams. I dreamed of the basement constantly, of being trapped down there, the light flickering out, a presence lurking in the shadows. I dreamed of hands reaching for me, clawing at my ankles, dragging me toward the darkness. One night, my mother had a dream, too. She dreamed she was standing at the top of the basement stairs. She could hear something whispering below, something calling her name. And in the dream, she started walking down, step by step. She couldn't stop herself, couldn't turn back. The whispers got louder, and just before she reached the bottom, she woke up screaming. After that, she refused to go down there. None of us did, but the basement didn't want to be ignored. The noises got louder. The door opened on its own more frequently. One night, we heard something dragging across the floor. A slow, scraping sound, like wood against concrete, like something moving down there. I gathered the courage to check. I flicked the light on, and saw that the old wooden rocking chair, the one that had been in the same corner for years, was now sitting in the middle of the basement, facing the stairs, facing me. The final straw came when my mother saw it. She had been watching TV late at night when she noticed something in the reflection of the screen, a dark figure standing in the doorway behind her. Her heart stopped. Slowly, she turned her head. There was nothing there, but when she checked the hallway, the basement door was open again. That was the night she decided we had to leave. We moved out a month later. The new owners didn't seem bothered when my mother warned them about the basement. They laughed it off, said old houses made noises. But 2 months after they moved in, they put the house back on the market. No explanation, no reason. They just left. Years later, I learned the truth. I found an old newspaper article about the house, and I finally understood what had been haunting us. In 1923, a man had lived in that basement, a tenant renting the lower level from the original owners. One night, there was a fire. It spread quickly, trapping him downstairs. By the time they put it out, it was too late. His body was never recovered. Some say he never left. Even now, I have nightmares. I dream of the basement door opening on its own. I dream of the rocking chair moving in the darkness. I dream of the whispers calling my name. And sometimes, I swear I can still smell the damp, rotting air, as if the basement is still waiting for me, as if something down there remembers me and wants me to come back. I saw her for the first time when I was 6 years old. She wasn't scary, not at first, just a little girl, standing at the foot of my bed, watching me. I thought she was a dream, until I saw her again, and again, and again, until I realized she wasn't going anywhere, until I realized she was never alive to begin with. We lived in a small, 2-story house in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't old, built sometime in the 1970s, so there was no reason for it to be haunted. At least, that's what I thought. But from the moment I was old enough to remember, I always felt like I wasn't alone in my room. At night, the air felt heavier. The shadows stretched a little too far. And sometimes, just before I fell asleep, I could hear breathing. Soft, steady, too close to my bed. The first time I saw her, I wasn't scared. She looked normal, like any other little girl. She was about my age, with long, blonde hair and a white nightgown that almost reached her feet. Her hands were clasped in front of her, her head slightly tilted, like she was curious about me. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She just stood there, watching. I pulled the blankets up to my chin. "Who are you?" I whispered. She didn't answer, didn't even blink. I wanted to call for my parents, but something in me, something deep in my gut, told me not to. Like if I screamed, she would get closer. I squeezed my eyes shut, telling myself it was a dream. When I opened them again, she was gone. I didn't tell anyone at first. I thought maybe I had imagined her. But a few nights later, she came back, standing in the same spot, same nightgown, same empty stare. This time, I noticed something different. Her feet weren't touching the ground. She was floating, just barely, like the air itself was holding her up. I turned to the wall, squeezing my eyes shut. But even with my back to her, I could still feel her staring, like her eyes were burned into my skin. I started sleeping with the light on, but it didn't help. She came anyway, always silent, always watching. Some nights, I wouldn't see her, but I would feel her presence in the room. The air would turn cold, the shadows would shift, and I would wake up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, knowing she had been there. Then she started getting closer. Each time she appeared, she was a little nearer to my bed, a foot away, then a few inches. Then, one night, I woke up and found her standing right beside me, her face too close to mine, her lips slightly parted, as if she was about to whisper something. But no sound came out, just her breath, cold and damp against my cheek. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't scream. And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone. I finally told my parents. I expected them to laugh it off, but my mother's face went pale. She didn't say anything at first. Then, after a long silence, she said, "You used to talk to someone in your sleep when you were little." My stomach dropped. She told me that, when I was around 3 years old, she would sometimes hear me whispering at night, having full conversations. But when she checked on me, I would be alone, sitting up in bed, talking to the empty air. I had no memory of this, but somehow, deep in my bones, I knew she was telling the truth. I had been speaking to her, even before I could remember. After that, the girl in white didn't just stay in my bedroom. She started appearing in other parts of the house. I would see her in the hallway, just out of the corner of my eye, reflected in the bathroom mirror, standing behind me. Once, I even saw her outside, standing in the middle of the road, staring up at my window. She never got closer than that night at my bedside, but she never left, either. She was always there, watching, waiting. For what? I never knew. The last time I saw her, I was 17. By then, I had gotten used to her. She didn't scare me like she used to. I had accepted that she was just a part of my life. But then, one night, something changed. She wasn't standing at the foot of my bed. She was standing at my door. And this time, she wasn't looking at me. She was looking past me, at something else in the room, something I couldn't see. I turned, heart pounding, but there was nothing behind me, just empty air. When I looked back at her, she was gone, and that was the last time I ever saw her. Years later, I told my younger brother about her, half expecting him to laugh. Instead, his face went pale. "I saw her too," he whispered. My blood ran cold. "She used to stand in my room," he said. "Did she ever say anything to you?" I asked. He hesitated. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "She told me not to turn around. We don't talk about her anymore. But sometimes, when I visit my childhood home, I feel like she's still there, like she's waiting for something. And I wonder, that last night, when she wasn't looking at me, what was she really looking at? And why did she tell my brother not to turn around? I don't think I want to know." Some houses just don't feel right. It's not something you can explain, not something you can prove. It's just a feeling deep in your bones that something is wrong, that something else is living there with you, watching, waiting. That's what my childhood home was like. And the worst part? It never wanted to let us leave. My parents bought the house when I was 6. It was a modest, 2-story home, built in the 1950s. Nothing fancy, just an ordinary house in an ordinary neighborhood. But from the moment we moved in, I knew something was off. I never wanted to be alone. Even in broad daylight, I felt like there were eyes on me. At first, my parents chalked it up to me being afraid of a new house. But it wasn't fear. It was something else, something I couldn't describe. And I wasn't the only one who felt it. The first thing that happened was the static. At random times, our TV would turn on by itself, always the static. Even stranger, sometimes we'd hear faint voices behind the white noise, like someone was trying to speak through the distortion. At first, my parents thought it was faulty wiring, but then the radio started doing it too, even when it was unplugged. Then came the whispers. At night, when the house was silent, I would hear it. Soft voices murmuring just beyond my door. Not words, just sounds. Almost like someone was standing in the hallway, whispering to themselves. The first time it happened, I was too scared to move. But after a few nights, I worked up the courage to check. I crept to my door and slowly cracked it open. The whispers stopped immediately. The hallway was empty, but the air was different, thicker, heavier, like something had just been there. Like something had been waiting for me to open the door. I told my parents. They didn't believe me. But then, my mother started waking up to scratches on the walls. Deep, jagged marks that hadn't been there the night before. She blamed me and my brother, but we both swore we had nothing to do with it. She didn't believe us. Not until she woke up to find scratches on the inside of her bedroom door. Things escalated after that. Objects moved on their own. Lights flickered, even after replacing the bulbs. And the whispers got louder. Now, they weren't just at night. They followed us everywhere. In the living room, in the kitchen, even in the bathroom. And sometimes, when I walked past a mirror, I swore I saw something standing behind me. Something tall and dark, just out of sight. But when I turned, there was never anyone there. One night, my brother and I were home alone when the knocking started. 3 loud, deliberate knocks, coming from inside the walls. We stood frozen, listening as the knocks moved, from the living room to the kitchen, then to the stairs. Step by step, coming closer. We locked ourselves in my room, too scared to breathe. And then, the doorknob started turning, slowly, back and forth, like something was testing the lock. We didn't sleep that night. After that, even my parents couldn't deny it anymore. We tried to ignore it, tried to pretend the house was normal, but it wasn't. And one night, we found out why. My mom was doing laundry when she noticed something wedged behind the basement stairs. A small wooden box, covered in dust. She opened it, and inside, she found a bundle of old cassette tapes. Curious, she played one. And what we heard still haunts me to this day. It was a man's voice, trembling, desperate. He was talking to someone, or something. "It won't let me sleep," he whispered. "It's always watching, always whispering." A long silence. Then, "I think it's inside the walls now." A loud bang cut through the tape. Then another. Then, a deep, inhuman growl. And then the tape cut off. My mother sat there, pale, shaking. She played another tape. Then another. All of them were the same. A man, growing more frantic, more broken, talking to something that wasn't there. And by the last tape, his voice was barely a whisper. "I see it now," he said. Another pause. A sharp scraping sound, like nails dragging against wood. Then, the tape ended. We moved out a month later. My parents never talked about what we heard. They never played the tapes again. And when we packed up, my mother left the box exactly where she had found it, behind the basement stairs, where it had always been. Years later, I looked up the house. I found an article buried in the archives. The man who had lived there before us had disappeared. They never found a body, but they found his journals. And in the final entry, written just days before he vanished, he wrote, "It's inside the house now. It's in the walls. I don't think I can leave. I still dream about that house. I dream about the whispers, about the knocking in the walls. And sometimes, I dream that I'm back in my old room, lying in bed, listening, waiting, for something that was never really gone. And I wake up feeling watched, like something followed me when we moved, like something never let me go, like it's still waiting for me to come back." Some hauntings aren't loud. They don't come with slamming doors or flickering lights. They don't shake the walls or drag furniture across the floor. Some hauntings are quiet, soft, like a whisper in the dark, like a voice just beneath the surface of your thoughts. And those are the ones that stay with you the longest. My family lived in a small, two-bedroom house when I was a kid. It wasn't old, it wasn't creepy, and it didn't look haunted. But from the moment we moved in, my brother and I felt it. Something was wrong. It was in the walls. It was in the air. And at night, it was beside our beds, whispering. It started small, soft rustling sounds in the corners of the room, tiny taps on the walls, like someone knocking from the other side. We told our parents, but they didn't believe us. "It's just the house settling," my dad said. But houses don't breathe. And late at night, when the world was silent, we could hear it. A faint, rasping breath coming from the foot of our beds. One night, my brother woke up screaming. I bolted upright, heart racing, expecting to see something standing in the room. But there was nothing. Just him, shaking, his eyes wide with terror. "It held me down," he whispered. I stared at him. "What?" "The whispering," he said. "It got closer, and then I couldn't move." He was crying, and I believed him, because I had heard it too. After that, we stopped sleeping alone. We stayed in the same bed, blankets pulled up to our chins, too scared to turn off the lights. But the whispering didn't stop. It got louder, and then it started saying our names. I'll never forget the first time I heard it. I was half asleep, my body heavy, drifting between dreams and wakefulness. Then, a voice, right beside my ear. A breathy, cracked whisper that said my name. Not like a person would say it. It was too stretched out, too slow. Like someone who hadn't spoken in years was trying to remember how. I felt a wave of cold air brush against my cheek. Then, the bed shifted, like someone was sitting at the foot of it. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I could only listen. As the whisper came again, and this time it laughed. I told my parents again the next morning. This time, my mother listened. She didn't say I was imagining it. She didn't tell me it was just a dream. She just went very quiet. And then, finally, she said, "This isn't the first time I've heard that." She told us that, some nights, when she was alone in the living room, she would hear it. Soft whispers, coming from inside the walls. At first, she thought it was just the wind, until the whispers said her name. And then, she swore she felt something brushing against her hair, breathing behind her. But when she turned around, there was never anyone there. Things got worse after that. Now that we acknowledged it, It didn't try to hide. It wanted us to hear it. It wanted us to listen. One night, my brother woke up choking. I flicked on the light, expecting him to be sick, but he wasn't. He was gripping his throat, gasping for air. His face was red. His eyes were wide with panic. And the worst part? His blanket was wrapped tightly around his neck, like someone had pulled it. That was the night my mother called someone. A priest. A family friend. Someone who believed us. He came the next morning, carrying a Bible and a small container of holy water. He walked the house, stopping in the hallway outside our rooms. He pressed his hand to the wall, and he went pale. "There's something here," he said. We already knew that. But then he said something else. Something that made my stomach drop. "It's been here for a long time." He blessed the house, sprinkled the holy water, said a long prayer in a language I didn't understand. The air felt lighter after that. For the first time in months, we slept without nightmares, without whispers, without feeling watched. We thought it was over, and for a while it was. Until the night before we moved out. I woke up to a familiar sound, a whisper, but this time, it wasn't beside my bed. It wasn't inside the walls. It was in my ear, so close I could feel the breath against my skin, and it said, "Don't leave." I screamed. The light flicked on. My mother ran into the room, shaking me awake. I told her what I heard. She just held me. She didn't ask if I was sure. She didn't tell me I was imagining it. She knew, because she had heard it too. We moved the next morning, and as we drove away, I felt something deep in my chest, a weight lifting, a sense of relief, but at the same time, a feeling of unsettling sadness, like something was watching us go, like something wasn't happy we were leaving. Years later, I met the family that moved in after us. They seemed nice, normal, but when I asked about the house, their expressions changed. They didn't say much, just that their youngest daughter had started sleepwalking, that she would stand in the hallway at night, facing the wall, listening, like she was waiting for someone to speak to her, like she was waiting for the whispering to return. I don't know what it wanted. I don't know why it whispered our names, but sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I swear I still hear it, soft, breathy, right against my ear, and I squeeze my eyes shut, because I know, if I listen too closely, it might never stop. Ever since moving to the old house on Maple Street, Janet and her husband Mark noticed strange occurrences that unsettled the once peaceful atmosphere. The house, with its Victorian architecture and sprawling garden, had seemed like a dream come true. However, within a week, its dreamy facade began to crumble under the weight of its mysterious past. It started with the electronics. Their brand new television would turn on by itself in the middle of the night, blaring static at full volume. A jarring wake-up at 3 a.m. that left Janet and Mark bleary-eyed and on edge. Initially, they attributed these disturbances to faulty wiring or a glitch in the system. But when the old-fashioned radio in the attic began to play 1940s music without being plugged in, they realized something more sinister was at play. The most unnerving incidents, however, involved the phone calls. The landline would ring at odd hours, and when answered, there was only static on the other end, occasionally interspersed with what sounded like distant whispering. Mark, ever the skeptic, spent several weekends trying to trace the issue, replacing the phone set and even calling in a technician, but no fault was found. One particularly chilling incident occurred just after midnight when Mark had left for a night shift. Janet was alone in the kitchen when the phone rang. Bracing herself for another round of static, she was instead met with a clear, cold voice that said, "I saw him leave. You are alone now." The caller ID showed no number, just an ominous blank screen. Frantically, she called Mark, who tried to calm her down, but the seed of terror was already sown. The disturbances escalated from there. Doors would slam shut, and the sound of footsteps echoed through the halls at night. Janet, feeling watched, would often turn to find a shadow fleeting from the corner of her eye. The couple's cat, usually a lazy, unbothered creature, began to hiss at empty spaces, her fur standing on end as if seeing something Janet and Mark could not. One evening, while Mark was away, Janet decided to confront whatever was haunting their home. Armed with nothing but a candle for light and a steely resolve, she walked through the house, demanding the presence reveal itself. As she passed the mirror in the hallway, she caught a glimpse of a figure standing behind her. Turning around, she saw nothing but felt a cold breath against her neck, sending shivers down her spine. Desperate for answers, Janet visited the local library to dig into the history of their home. She discovered it was built in the late 1800s by a wealthy shipbuilder who was rumored to have gone mad after the loss of his wife and children to the sea. It was said he roamed the house in grief, unable to leave even in death. The pieces of the puzzle began to fit together, the haunting making tragic sense. Seeking help, they contacted a medium who agreed to hold a seance in their living room. With candles flickering and a circle of salt around them, the medium called out to the spirits. After moments of silence, a violent gust of wind blew out the candles, and the room temperature dropped. Through the medium, the spirit of the shipbuilder spoke, expressing his sorrow and his yearning for his family, his presence anchored to the house by his undying grief. The medium helped the spirit understand that his family was gone and that he could find peace in the afterlife. She performed a cleansing ritual, burning sage and chanting prayers. As the smoke filled the room, there was a final, palpable shift in the air. A lightness, as if a heavy burden had been lifted. In the weeks that followed, the house was quiet. The phone no longer rang at night, and the electronics remained off. Janet and Mark started to feel at ease, the eerie feeling of being watched slowly fading away. They had managed to give the old shipbuilder the peace he needed, and in return, he had granted them peace in their new home. Their experience with the supernatural left Janet and Mark with a profound sense of the beyond. A story they would one day tell with a mix of fear and awe. But for now, they enjoyed their reclaimed sanctuary, the nightmare of the past few months finally over, as they looked forward to making new, happier memories in the old house on Maple Street. Janet often found herself pausing by the old fireplace, the epicenter of many eerie occurrences, now silent and peaceful. She would lay fresh flowers there weekly, a tribute to the shipbuilder and a symbol of new beginnings. Mark took to repairing the old fixtures and furnishings, each stroke of his tools a reinforcement of their claim to a home they now truly felt was theirs. Together, they had turned a place of haunts into a haven, proving that even the most disturbed spirits could find rest with a little understanding and a lot of courage. Growing up in the quiet suburban town of Westridge, Emily always felt that her family's house was a bit peculiar. Nestled at the end of a cul-de-sac, the three-story Victorian home had been in her family for generations. As a child, Emily was enchanted by its hidden nooks and expansive attic, but as she grew older, she became increasingly aware of its eerie quirks. The house's peculiarities began with small, inexplicable incidents. Emily would often hear gentle tapping sounds coming from the walls, especially late at night when the rest of her family was asleep. Initially, her parents dismissed these noises as the house settling, but the frequency and intensity of the noises began to escalate. One autumn evening, Emily was home alone, her parents having gone out for a dinner date. She was in the kitchen preparing a snack when she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps upstairs. Knowing she was the only one home, a chill ran down her spine. Tentatively, she called out, "Hello," but only silence answered back. Gathering her courage, Emily grabbed a kitchen knife and crept upstairs. As she reached the top of the staircase, the footsteps stopped abruptly. She searched every room, but found nothing out of place. Puzzled and frightened, she hurried back downstairs. The incidents grew stranger and more frequent. Doors would slam shut without any draft, and the old chandelier in the dining room would sway gently, even on still days. Emily's bedroom, located on the second floor, often felt unusually cold, and she would wake up in the middle of the night feeling as if someone was watching her. Determined to understand what was happening, Emily began researching the history of her home. She discovered that it had been built in the late 1800s by a prominent local doctor who was rumored to have conducted strange experiments in what was now the attic. After his untimely death, the house changed hands several times before Emily's great-grandparents purchased it. Convinced that her house was haunted, Emily sought help from a local psychic known for her expertise in paranormal activity. The psychic, Mrs. Green, agreed to visit the house and conduct a seance in an attempt to communicate with any spirits that might be present. On the night of the seance, Emily, her parents, and Mrs. Green gathered in the living room, the air thick with anticipation. Mrs. Green instructed everyone to join hands as she began chanting in a low, mesmerizing tone. The candles flickered as if caught in a non-existent breeze, and the temperature in the room dropped perceptibly. Suddenly, Mrs. Green's voice changed, becoming deeper and more distant. She began speaking in what sounded like an old dialect of English, conveying messages from a spirit who claimed to be the doctor who had built the house. The spirit spoke of unfinished business and a hidden journal that contained all his secrets. Shaken by the experience, Emily and her family thanked Mrs. Green, who advised them to search the attic for the journal. The next day, Emily and her father went up to the attic, where they found a hidden panel behind a false wall. Inside, they discovered a dusty, leather-bound journal filled with handwritten notes and strange diagrams. The journal revealed that the doctor had been obsessed with finding a cure for his ailing wife and had conducted numerous medical experiments, hoping to discover a miracle treatment. His entries became increasingly erratic, and the final entry chillingly suggested that he had tried to summon supernatural forces to save his wife's life. Armed with this new understanding, Emily felt a mix of sympathy and horror. She decided to hold another session with Mrs. Green to help the doctor's spirit find peace. This time, they conducted the ritual in the attic, directly addressing the doctor's spirit, acknowledging his grief, and urging him to let go of the world of the living. The seance seemed to work. The house gradually became warmer, and the strange occurrences ceased. Emily and her family continued to live there, no longer disturbed by unexplained noises or cold drafts. Years later, Emily often reflected on the experience, grateful for the peace that had been restored to her beloved home. She kept the doctor's journal in a glass case in the living room, a reminder of the house's history and the thin veil between the past and the present. As she grew up, she would share the story with visitors, not just as a tale of haunting, but as a testament to the power of understanding and closure, even in the most unusual circumstances. Liam had always felt uneasy about the basement of the old house they had moved into on the outskirts of town. It was a spacious property, seemingly a steal for the price, but the basement had a persistent dampness and a chill that seemed resistant to every attempt at heating. However, it was the inexplicable occurrences that began almost immediately that truly unsettled him. It started with the whispers. Late at night, when the house was silent, Liam would hear hushed voices that seemed to emanate from the walls of the basement itself. These were not the creaks and groans of an old house settling, but clear, distinct murmurs discussing things he could not quite understand. At first, Liam tried to dismiss these sounds as his imagination, fueled by the stress of the move and his new job in a strange city. But then the shadows began to appear. Liam would see fleeting glimpses of figures out of the corner of his eye, especially when he was downstairs doing laundry or fetching tools. These weren't the full-bodied apparitions one might expect from ghost stories. Rather, they were ephemeral, almost like a trick of the light, except they moved with purpose and intent. One evening, while his wife, Clara, was visiting her sister, Liam decided to investigate the basement more thoroughly. He thought perhaps some practical explanation would present itself. An animal stuck in the walls, or outside light casting shadows. As he descended the stairs with a flashlight in hand, the air grew perceptibly colder, and the familiar whispers swelled. A sense of dread settled over him, heavier with each step he took. Reaching the bottom, Liam scanned the room with his light. The basement was largely unfinished, with exposed beams and concrete floors. As his light swept over the far corner, he paused. There, the shadows seemed to gather and thicken, even as his beam pointed directly at them. Heart pounding, he approached slowly. The whispers crescendoed, almost as if in warning, then abruptly stopped as he reached the heart of the shadows. The temperature dropped so sharply it left frost on the inside of his breath. Liam, standing frozen, felt an overwhelming presence. It was as if the darkness itself was alive, watching him. Compelled by a mixture of fear and determination, he spoke aloud. "Who are you? What do you want?" There was no response, only the oppressive silence that followed. After several moments, Liam retreated, the weight of unseen eyes upon him. Back upstairs, the normalcy of the kitchen, with its humming refrigerator and ticking clock, seemed a world away from the gloom below. Unable to sleep and unwilling to leave the mystery alone, Liam started researching the history of the house. Through old property records and newspaper archives, he uncovered a tragic past. The house had been built in the early 1900s by a local doctor who was well respected in the community. However, hidden beneath the veneer of success was a darker tale. The doctor's daughter had been ill, and in his desperation to cure her, he turned to practices that were frowned upon at the time, delving into realms of spiritualism and the occult. His daughter died under mysterious circumstances, and grief-stricken, the doctor himself disappeared shortly thereafter. His research led Liam to a local historian, Mrs. Hobbs, who specialized in the town's Victorian-era history. She confirmed the stories and added that there were rumors the doctor had conducted bizarre experiments in the basement, attempting to contact his deceased daughter. These tales were dismissed by many as superstition, but she believed there was truth to them. Determined to put an end to whatever was lingering in the basement, Liam contacted a team of paranormal investigators. Equipped with various devices, they set up in the basement one night. As the investigators worked, the atmosphere grew tense and the temperature dropped, just as Liam had experienced. Their equipment registered unexplained electromagnetic fields and captured EVP, electronic voice phenomenon, recordings that seemed to echo the desperate whispers Liam had heard. After several hours, the lead investigator, a medium, conducted a cleansing ritual. She used sage and salt, chanting incantations meant to soothe restless spirits. As she worked, the shadows in the corner seemed to dissolve, and the air warmed slightly. Since the night of the investigation, the whispers ceased, and the shadows no longer danced at the corners of Liam's eyes. The house felt lighter, as if a heavy veil had been lifted. Liam and Clara continued to live there, the basement now just a normal part of their home. Yet, Liam often caught himself listening intently in the quiet of the night, half expecting the whispers to return, a reminder of the house's hidden depths and the thin line between the past and the present. Jessica and Alex had just moved into their new apartment in the bustling heart of the city. The building was old, with a charm that had instantly drawn them to it despite its well-worn facade and creaky floorboards. They were excited to start their new life together, but their excitement soon gave way to unease as peculiar things began to occur. It all started with minor anomalies. Jessica noticed that her keys would not be where she had left them. At first, she chalked it up to forgetfulness, but when the keys started appearing in impossible places, like inside a sugar bowl or beneath a stack of unopened mail, she couldn't ignore it any longer. Alex experienced his own set of oddities. His books would rearrange themselves on their shelves, genres inexplicably mixed, and once he found his cherished copy of Moby Dick in the refrigerator. One chilly evening, as they settled in for a quiet night, the peculiarities escalated. They were watching a movie when both felt a cold draft sweep through the room. The windows were closed, and the heating was on. Puzzled, Alex got up to check the thermostat when the TV volume increased to its maximum. Startled, he dropped the remote, which they found later in the freezer, inexplicably cold to the touch. Conversations about these incidents became routine. Jessica and Alex tried to joke about their ghostly roommate, but the humor did little to mask their growing discomfort. Then, one night, the disturbances became more direct. Jessica was home alone, reading in bed when the lights flickered and went out. Assuming it was a power outage, she reached for her phone, only to see a shadow pass swiftly by her bedroom door. Frozen in fear, she watched as the door slowly creaked open and then slammed shut with force. Heart racing, she called Alex, who rushed home, finding her huddled by the bed, visibly shaken. Determined to understand what was happening, they reached out to their neighbors to see if anyone else had experienced similar disturbances. To their surprise, several had. An elderly neighbor, Mrs. Kowalski, who had lived in the building since her youth, shared stories about the previous occupants of Jessica and Alex's apartment. She spoke of a troubled young man who had lived there in the 1970s, known for his eccentric behavior and sudden disappearance. Some believed he had left, but others whispered he had met a more sinister fate within those very walls. With Mrs. Kowalski's tales echoing in their minds, Jessica and Alex decided to seek professional help. They contacted a local paranormal investigation team, known for their expertise in dealing with urban hauntings. The team arrived with equipment and cameras, eager to document the apartment's paranormal activity and provide some explanations. The investigation took place over a weekend. The team set up night vision cameras in every room, audio recorders, and electromagnetic field meters to detect any unusual activity. The first night was quiet, but on the second night, the apartment seemed to awaken. Lights flickered, cold drafts moved through the rooms, and a faint voice was captured on one of the audio recorders, whispering indistinctly. The climax of the investigation occurred late on the final night. The team conducted a seance in the living room, where most of the activity had been concentrated. With Jessica and Alex present, they called out to the spirit, asking it to reveal itself. The temperature in the room dropped, and a dense, palpable silence enveloped them. Suddenly, the medium, who was leading the seance, gasped and spoke in a voice not her own, pleading for help and expressing confusion and sadness. The investigators concluded that the spirit of the young man Mrs. Kowalski had mentioned was indeed present, trapped within the apartment due to his untimely and unresolved passing. They performed a cleansing ritual, using sage and salt, while offering words of guidance to help the spirit find peace and move on from the earthly realm. In the days that followed, the apartment felt lighter, and the odd occurrences ceased. Jessica and Alex noticed a significant change. The air felt fresher, and there was a sense of calm that hadn't been there before. They thanked the team, relieved to have restored peace to their home. Though they continued to live in the apartment, Jessica and Alex would often reflect on the experience. Their skepticism about the paranormal irrevocably altered. They remained in touch with Mrs. Kowalski, who was pleased to hear that the disturbances had ended. The couple learned to appreciate the history of their home, mindful of the past's deep imprints and the unseen forces that, on occasion, brush against the world of the living. Thomas and Melanie had recently settled into their new home, a stately manor on the outskirts of a sleepy rural town. The house, with its sprawling lawn and grandiose architecture, had been a steal at the auction, largely due to its reputation. The locals whispered about its past, filled with tales of misfortune and unexplained events, which had kept many potential buyers away. But Thomas, a history professor with a penchant for the mysterious, and Melanie, a freelance writer with a love for old homes, were undeterred. From the moment they moved in, the couple sensed an oddity in the atmosphere of the house. It began with the sounds: footsteps in the attic when no one was upstairs, the clinking of glasses in the dining room when both were in bed, and faint music that seemed to drift through the halls from an unknown source. One late evening, while Thomas was researching the history of their new home in his study, he stumbled upon an old diary belonging to a previous owner, a young woman named Eliza who lived in the late 1800s. Her entries were filled with joy initially, detailing the lavish parties she hosted and the love she had for the house. However, as Thomas flipped through the pages, the tone shifted dramatically. Eliza spoke of a creeping dread, of shadows that moved against the grain of natural light, and a chilling cold that settled over her bedroom, stifling her breaths. Meanwhile, Melanie experienced her own unsettling encounters. One night, while photographing the interior for her blog, her camera captured what appeared to be figures in the background, silhouettes of people not present when she took the photos. These figures were dressed in Victorian attire, staring out from the photographs with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Concerned yet intrigued, they decided to delve deeper into the history of the house and learned about a fire that had tragically ended a ball hosted by Eliza, claiming her life along with several guests. The local library held newspaper clippings that described the horrific event and how the house had stood abandoned for years afterward, falling into disrepair until it was restored in the early 20th century. As the days grew shorter and the nights colder, the occurrences in the house intensified. Doors would slam shut, trapping Melanie in rooms until she cried out in terror, only for the doors to swing open calmly as if nothing had happened. Thomas saw reflections in the mirror that vanished when he turned, and the air would sometimes fill with the faint scent of smoke and burnt fabric. Determined to confront whatever haunted their home, Thomas and Melanie contacted a well-known paranormal investigation team. The team arrived with sophisticated equipment, ready to document and perhaps communicate with the spirits of the house. Over a tense weekend, they set up cameras and audio recorders throughout the manor. During a night-long vigil, they captured EVPs, electronic voice phenomena, that whispered names and pleas for help. A medium who accompanied the team conducted a seance in the grand ballroom, where she claimed to make contact with Eliza's spirit. The medium relayed messages of unrest and fear, painting a vivid picture of the night of the fire and the chaos and confusion that led to the tragic deaths. The investigators concluded that the spirits were trapped, reliving their final moments in a loop, unable to move on. With the consent of Thomas and Melanie, they performed a cleansing ritual, using ancient chants and burning sage to purify the house. They invited the spirits to find peace, to move beyond the manor's confines and into the light. In the following weeks, the house underwent a transformation. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, replaced by a serene calm. The strange occurrences ceased, and Thomas and Melanie finally felt at home. Grateful for the peace restored to their home, they decided to honor the history of the house rather than fear it. Thomas dedicated a section of his study to the house's past, including Eliza's diary and the photographs Melanie took. They hosted an exhibition on the property's history, inviting locals and historians alike, sharing the tales of the manor not with fear, but with respect and remembrance. Their home became a beloved landmark in the community, a symbol of rebirth and reconciliation with the past. Thomas and Melanie, once outsiders, were now custodians of a living history, a bridge between eras and the keepers of stories that had once been lost to time.